Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. As you can see from the title here, we're here today to talk about From Chaos to Control, the critical role of data management. But first, I just wanted to share a few things that we pulled together during the research that led up to today's webinar and also supported the white paper that we recently published on this topic as well. As you can see here, we are awash in data. I don't think there's any industry that has not been affected by this. There's a lot of information out there around how data is changing things and business operations and expectations, et cetera. What we found is that from IDC, who many of you are familiar with, the researchers and analysts there, this is a multi-trillion-dollar market. There's a lot of spending and services and technologies going on that enable this digital transformation, which really is what's driving all of this data. So it's not a big thing, and it's growing, and it's not going away. Another aspect of this is when you just step back and look at the data itself in terms of the volume, the velocity, and the variety of data that's coming at us in terms of how do we manage this stuff before we can even think about applying it with different use cases. And you can see here, it's a lot of data. Different analyst estimates seem to come in at about 120 trillion gigabytes of data generated this year alone, which is hard to wrap one's head around, but I think that's something to be mindful of as we go about our work. Today, you'll hear a lot of discussion around data management and data governance. What's the difference between the two? We found some definitions that we think are helpful. The first being around data management, which is really about something that is more system or technology centric in terms of what are those tools, what are those systems that are collecting, keeping, and using the data securely, efficiently, and cost effectively, whereas data governance is a little more people and process oriented. They're not completely different, but I think when you think of data management, you think of things like big, large databases, data warehouses, putting data in the cloud. Those are all the systems and tools help you manage that data, whereas the government is how are people going to access this? How are they going to use it? How are you going to make sure it's secure? So just think of it in those terms where management is a little more system centric, governance is a little more people and process centric. One of the things that we explored in the run-up to today, as well as in the development of the white paper, which, by the way, you'll all be getting a copy of, we'll make sure we include that in the follow-up, is some best practices that emerged around the data management and governance area, particularly in the asset management world. So let's just take a brief look at these. The first one is getting the right people in the right roles. And from a very high level, just to share a few thoughts with you, the first is this idea around stewardship. You may hear terms like data steward. This is typically at the executive level where these folks are looking at the data as an asset. These might be folks who might have a label like the executive sponsor for an initiative in your organization. There's also folks who own the data, which is usually a pretty small group of people, but they're maintaining and ensuring cleanliness and access for the data. There's other roles, for instance, like data architects who are making sure from the very start that the right structure is in place to be able to execute on these use cases and manage all of this data. There's others as you go forward, and again, there's a lot more detail on this in the white paper. The second of 5 is to build the asset hierarchy, and speaking to this audience, I think you're all familiar and aware of this. We explored it a little bit in the white paper, but one of the things we found was that this is one of these very foundational things. Folks who don't start with this probably get in trouble a little bit down the road. This is typically described in terms of the approach with an asset hierarchy as being a parent-child or even a parent-child-grandchild structure in terms of how the data is organized around these assets. And I think, again, for this audience, you're probably aware of this. The point here is this isn't something you do later in the process. Next is the implementation and enforcement of standards. This is really important, and a lot of the folks we spoke with pointed out that they work in an environment where the business is growing and evolving. You may go from one very small facility, and over the course of time, you may expand. We're having multiple facilities on different geographies, and different practices can emerge at each of these different sites. So you have to have these standards in place, because if you don't, you're going to get stuck later with a lot of issues around how you're managing and governing that data. The fourth one that we looked at is getting it right the first time. This is kind of a common thread through all the things that we explored, but I do want to share one quote from you from one of the folks we interviewed for this paper. This is a colleague of mine who's worked in the data and analytics space for over 2 decades. and he's been there and done that. He worked mostly in the manufacturing and energy worlds, so I think his practice is very relevant. One of the things he said to us was it's impossible to overstate the need to get data entered and saved correctly from day one of any IT or analytics initiative that has a significant data component to it. These types of initiatives tend to be 80% data and 20% analytics. This really drives home the importance of having sound data management and governance practices in place from the start of a project going forward. And just a minute about the 80-20 rule. Having worked in that analytics space myself, as many of you have, everyone likes to talk about the really cool stuff they're doing with the use cases in terms of being predictive and prescriptive. But to get there, if you're not doing that very basic, just grinding it out on the data management governance, you're never going to get to that 20%. So I think entering into these types of initiatives in data-rich environments, understanding that 80-20 rule is going to be helpful. Finally, just wanted to make sure that you're communicating and sharing the power of your data. This can be in the form of just making sure you're staying engaged with your executive sponsors and data stewards, and you may even have an executive steering committee. Reporting and addressing issues early so they don't get ahead or get away from you, but also not being shy about highlighting the successes. Most large initiatives will have different points where they're starting to show value, and really highlighting that is going to buy you a lot of time and a lot of mileage in terms of being able to do more on these types of initiatives. And the second thing to think about is leveraging that data itself. Are you developing dashboards? Are you using different visualization tools where you're saying, hey, we had this data set, here's something we did with it, and here's the business result. I think that's going to get you a lot of mileage in your initiative as well. So those are just some thoughts. I really wanted to just make sure we're framing some of the issues as we dive into this with our panelists, which we're going to do right now. So the first person we're going to hear from is Balaji Govindan, and let me just tell you a little bit about Balaji and his background. He's the director in the IT side of the house in utility operations and enterprise integration at Alliant Energy, which is a Fortune 1000 electric utility in the Midwest. He's been there since August of 2022, where he leads the asset and work management, GIS, mobile workforce management, outage management, and enterprise integration areas. He's currently responsible to deliver technology solutions to one of their major transformation programs. Previously, Balaji worked at Ameren, which is another large utility in the Midwest, for 26 years in a variety of roles. Balaji served as the director of digital work management and GIS when he left the company. He played many roles ranging from application lead, supervisor, manager, senior manager, and director. He successfully implemented many projects in the areas of asset and work management. Balaji is originally from India and has been in the St. Louis area for the last 27 years. He has an MS in math and an MBA from Webster University. He also serves on the customer advisory board for Click Software and has presented at the Oracle Open World Conference on project management. So Balaji, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Appreciate everyone attending this important discussion about data governance. Just a quick note on Alliant Energy. I don't know how many of you know the Alliant Energy. It's in the generation and the distribution investor-owned utility. You can see the service territory. We have about 1 million electric customers, approximately 500 natural gas customers. We serve about 50,000 square miles of service area. Alliant has about 3,100 employees, 4.2 billion in operating revenues, and 20.2 billion on the overall assets as of 2022. We got about 33 million megawatt hours of generation per year through a mix of fuel, hydro, wind, and solar. So if anybody knows about Alliant Energy is very big on clean energy blueprint, which means we are accelerating to renewable energy. We own a lot of solar and wind. If you have seen the news, we're also going to have a big battery storage project as well that's going on with Alliant. So that's a real quick view of Alliant. So now let's dive into data governance. So in my opinion, when you talk about data governance, a lot of utility companies, I work for Ameren, work for Alliant, I do talk to other utility industry. It's most of the times data governance is after the fact or after the project is over. Oh my God, my data is messed up, all those good stuff. So we have to consider this as part of our strategy, right? So you have to start with our executive buy-in. So from a strategic standpoint, you need to form a data governance executive team so that the team will make sure that they have a business alignment, make sure that you have all approved policies and procedures in place, and then also authorize some of the strategic roles, which we talk about in the next few slides. So start with an executive sponsorship, making sure that why data governance is very important. As Mike said, data is an asset, especially in the utility industry. It's all driven. It's a very capital asset intensive business. So your asset and data goes together. So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about a little bit about tactical perspective, right? You start with our executive buy-in for why data governance is important. Then you form, I think Mike did talk about the right roles, right? Steering committee. You need to form a data governance steering committee. What the purpose of the steering committee is to chart with setting some data governance priorities, because not every data is important. You cannot start with a big elephant and then start biting it. So then you talk about data governance owners, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then you need to make sure that you're revising your data policies, coming up with a data governance charter, and then also promoting cross-functional data governance through data governance working group sponsorship, and making sure that you have sustaining activity occurs and how you monitor those data governance performance. So at Alliant, I'll give you a small example. We've been going through some lot of major transformation programs. So your asset hierarchy, which I think Mike talked about, right? You have a generation assets, you have a distribution assets, you have a solar, you have a wind, all those assets. So setting up those hierarchy and making sure that what critical data elements that are very important for those data domains, understanding who the owner is for each one of them, and making sure that we form those groups, and which we'll talk about in the next slide. So it's very important identifying the data, identifying the subject matter expert, identifying the critical data elements for your assets. In the utility industry space, as we know, asset data is one area, and then you go with the GIS data is another area, and then you go with our outage management, and then you have customer data, supply chain data. So you have so many data domains that you need to focus on, and then identifying the data. The steering committee will be identifying who those data owners and stewards for each one of those areas, which we'll talk about the next slide. Moving on to the next slide. So this is your operational aspect, right? This is where the meat of the data governance is, where you have your working group business stewards. A lot of times, what I've seen in the utility industry is people say IT owns the data. IT says no, business owns the data. So at the end of the day, business owns the data, right? Because they understand the processes, they understand what is the operational data, they understand how the data communicates between the systems and so on. So we will have the working group business stewards. So they will identify the critical data elements, which is what I call about CDE, and then approve and promote your critical data element definition, and then the data governance within the business unit, right? So in example, Alliant Energy, I work with the GIS team. That's one team, one business unit. Then we also have a work management team. That's another business unit team. So working with each one of the team and identifying those critical data elements, and also making sure that who those data stewards are is very important. And then you need to monitor this quality audits, because whenever you identify this business steward, we all know they have the regular full-time work, right? So they take this as a kind of a side job. So we need to identify those data stewards and setting the expectations and making sure that the data quality is improved, and then come up with some kind of a metrics would be a good idea. So you can see monitoring compliance and also delivering some of the training, which we talk about in a minute. So what we did was at Alliant Energy, just want to give you a quick picture. So let's take a simple example. If you're in the utility industry, many people know compatible units is very, very important. Okay, that's how you basically, whenever you create a work and you basically say how much of labor you need, how much material you need, it's a library of compatible units. I've seen people go and create those compatible units left and right, right? All of a sudden you see 70,000 compatible units in an utility industry, but in reality, you probably is good to manage anywhere 13,000 to 15,000 in a mid-size utility compatible unit. So that's one example where data is very important. If you allow everybody to make changes, allow everybody to do or create those compatible units, pretty quickly you see many duplicates and stuff like that, which is another example for item master, which I'm not going to go through it, but that's another data element that we can talk about. So in a nutshell, you start with a strategic executive buy-in for data governance. Then you go into the tactical side where you identify those steering committee members, and then your operationalize it, which is basically your data owners and data stewards. So that's my quick few minutes update on the data governance.
Very good. Thanks, Balaji. And I was keeping a few notes here. I'm gonna, man, you said a few things I wanna ask you some questions about. So we'll get to that after we hear from our next panelist. That's Noel Neuwirth with Skookum, and let me tell you a little something about Noel. Noel is the reliability and asset management architect at Skookum, where he's responsible for the design and execution standard solutions across all 10 of Skookum's infrastructure sites. Prior to this position, he was a site reliability engineer for Skookum's North Sound Base operating support contract located at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. Over 20 years, Noel has learned the maintenance management field from the ground up, starting as being a maintenance electrician and mechanic, then planner, scheduler, EAM, CMMS data manager, and site reliability engineer. He led the configuration and deployment of 2 large-scale systems at a global manufacturing company and refinery. He also led the functional stand-up of the Skookum Maximo system, including full mobility, client system integration, and advanced components. So, Noel, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks, Mike. Hey, everyone. Yeah, Skookum, really quickly, Skookum Contract Services, we are an interesting company. We are a nonprofit, originally founded in 1988 in Bremerton, Washington. And our real mission is dedicated to creating opportunities for people with disabilities. And Skookum specializes in facilities management and logistics support services for federal and commercial customers. And we're really good at utilizing technology and industry best practices, to deliver some exceptional service to our customers. And we also have a really rich history of maintaining prestigious military installations and industrial campuses. And we are responsible for a lot of assets and a lot of data across over 25 different sites across 13 states. And having accurate asset data is so important and very challenging. Many of you have lived this or experienced it. And in the GAO study from the Government Accountability Office, they call out, you can see it in the slide there, in a practical sense, collecting data is a big challenge for many organizations. And Skookum has seen those challenges across many, many sites. And it's difficult to collect these data and to combine and apply them in a way that's useful. And I think this is very true, this next part, that the process can feel overwhelming to people within organizations. And we've experienced some of that. We've seen different levels of asset data quality and data quality across those different sites. And, there are some negative impacts to poor asset data. And it really starts with, what assets do we own or are we responsible for? Do those assets have a maintenance strategy, a defined PM or job plan? Other things like, have we identified spare parts or linked documents? And what's the right way to maintain that asset? How do we make improvements? And, those are all really important things that with data, you can do really well. Without good asset data, there's going to be some issues. And, those support maintenance and reliability. Other things that we've seen, what's the condition or age or that overall health of that asset? What do breakdown costs look like? And is our PM program effective? And are we funding correctly for the right number of assets with the right PMs? And is that all being funded? And are we planning correctly for labor, materials, and overall effort? And the important repair versus replace decision. So a lot of these things kind of come to life with good asset data and just having good, accurate data overall. Very challenging to collect it, manage it, maintain it, have good governance over the data. In the next slide, we get to see, for us, for Skookum, I think there are a couple keys to maintaining accurate asset data. For us, it starts with our C-level folks, our CXO team. And, so it starts at the top, that quality data and governance, it really is a priority. And we link it to our business intelligence dashboards and views. Then, different business lines, they get onboarded, they're held accountable for, some of the measured data and some of the asset details. And, part of that leadership approach, definitely starts at the top with that C-level team, but we really bring that asset, we heard it earlier, stewardship, some of that governance, we bring it right down to our technicians, and we enable them with mobility. So, in the field, they're able to perform different data collection, data verification, steps and activities really easily. So that's been a big thing for us is, across the organization, get everyone on board with the importance of good asset data. And, digitizing all that, giving iPads to folks, it's got to be better than paper. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be a good app that, they're not going to get frustrated with. And the techs want to use it. And, I think that kind of enables some of that ownership over the asset and the asset data. And that effective tech mobility, having those devices in the field, that's really been a key for us for having an accurate asset inventory and all that core data that goes with all those assets and systems. And, they're providing the info from the technicians. It needs to be two ways. So they're able to then leverage and utilize all that data. Suddenly diagrams, operation manual, maintenance manuals become available as more data comes into the system, like simple things, even make, model, serial number. Suddenly more information becomes available to them. And that becomes actionable information, and really transforming that data into something that they can use to kind of further, reliability, maintaining that asset, keeping it operational. And, I think we've done a good job of putting data on our dashboards, measuring progress from our different sites on kind of where they are in their journey. And you can't ignore that data. And, it's easy to say, well, look how maybe poor some of these data sets are, but, focus on, who's doing a good job collecting it, where are your star performers, and, keep focus on that information. Building business line views that matter, real metrics, measurements, KPIs, and different dashboards that, actually impact the team and is aligned with their overall goals is really important. And, site-specific views as well as those corporate views, more dashboards, been very, very helpful. Everything's in our Maximo system, So it's really easy to create, but intelligent, different types of views. So those are some of the, quickly, some of the keys that we found to really maintaining data, collecting, governance. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thanks, Noel. And we'll be hearing from you in a moment as well when we open up the discussion. But first, we're going to bring it home with our final panelists' opening remarks. And this is James Lewis, who many of you may know. James is the Executive Vice President of Operations at Aquitas Solutions. He's an experienced leader with a passion for maintenance and management. He joined Aquitas in 2017 and now leads the company's day-to-day operations while managing a growing team of maintenance professionals to drive client success within the asset management world. His responsibilities include operational strategy, driving growth and profitability, and building strong relationships with customers and partners. He has led many complex projects and teams across many vertical industries while at Aquitas and around the world for the U.S. military as an engineering officer for both the U.S. Army and Navy. James holds a BS in mechanical engineering from the U.S. Military Academy and is active in several Maximo user groups and industry affiliations. So James, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Mike. Just noticing that that photo is a couple years aged and before kids, so yeah, I guess that's what happens.
Happens to the best of us.
So yeah, but as you mentioned, real quick, Aquitas, we're an IBM business partner and focus on maximum implementations and upgrades. So, and I think the key point there is variety of industries. And, really where I wanted to look at this was from perspective and to bring home is, from different industries, data continues to be the problem. There's a lot of issues that we see that, isn't agnostic of what industry you are. The data is important. One thing I often tell folks is, you're purchasing a database software. At the core of it is the data. It has to be good. We have to start somewhere, because if we don't, that's where we're going to lead into these poor performance. I mean, it is the leading risk for our Maximo projects. We start, oftentimes folks think they have good data. We enter into a project, and then we start to realize that the data isn't as sound as we thought it was. So, at that point, we're going back and we're trying to see if there's still value in that business case, going back to the well per se and asking, our stakeholders, can we have more money? Because all of a sudden we realize that our implementation is going to run behind because our data wasn't as good as we thought. And this all, continues to snowball throughout the implementation into the ultimate performance of the EAM solution, or Maximo in this case, for user adoption and acceptance. We heard from Noel here from, a technician standpoint. It has to enable and improve the technician's life. It has to be better for them. Otherwise, they're not going to use it. And the only way we're going to do that is with good data. So once again, got to focus on that data. And ultimately, why are we doing this? We're bringing this in for, good asset management, PMs, etc. We have to have that core data to build it up. And once we have that, it allows us to optimize in certain areas. I highlighted here spare parts inventory. That's typically one of the areas that we can get the most ROI out of a project. All of a sudden, we can shrink storerooms. We can start having parts ordered and on demand and delivered before we're doing the work order versus putting 100 bearings on the shelf. We can order them, bearings, oil, filters, whatever it may need. All of a sudden, they can start appearing a few weeks before that PM is due. And this also helps with the optimization and doing lifecycle management. How do we know that these parts are attached to said asset? And when we start going through the lifecycle and decommissioning said assets, what goes with it? What stays? Are there other parts within this storeroom that can be used in other equipment and assets that exist within our storerooms, or excuse me, our facilities? So it starts to allow us to optimize, in certain different areas. And finally, back to the business. This is where it all starts. We have different KPIs, reports, etc. They're all going to, we want to make sure our data is good so we can have those accurate reports, so we can actually make actionable decisions based off of the good data that we have. And then it also turns into connected systems and integrations. What are we connecting to? Where are we getting this data from? Is it also accurate? So, that's, some of the highlights of why it's good. So next slide, please. But so as we move into it, and from the perspective that I wanted to bring here is when we start looking at clients and we start working, to bring an asset management system such as Maximo to your organization, you don't have to wait for us to get involved to work on your data. This comes back to the company, and it comes back to each individual organization and what you have. You can assess your current data quality just by talking to your business leaders, your maintenance technicians, and other individuals, and take a look at your data and say, do we even trust what we have? This can all start well before we start building that business case for a new EAM system. We can look at it and understand, for an EAM to function, there's certain things that are just required, and if we don't have that core data, it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to delay our projects. Such things as assets. We're buying an asset management system. We have to have good asset data. Attributes, the engineering documents, the maintenance guides, procedures, job plans, PMs, spare parts. All of these items are extremely important just to the asset, but how does it relate to the items that we support and we're ultimately putting back onto that asset to fix it? So we have the parts catalogs, the vendors, the suppliers, finance data, and the GLs. Where are we charging it to? These are some of the core items that we have to start looking at, and you can start looking at those internally today before you ever move to an asset management system. It's not too late, but I can tell you when we start to get into a project, all those skeletons are going to fall out of the closet, and we're going to have to deal with it. And the problem is do we deal with it while we're on a set project schedule, or can we take care of this and make it a small project before we even enter into an implementation such as that for Maximo? And when we start looking at these items and we start figuring out, man, we do have a lot of skeletons, we have to make decisions. We have to make decisions as a business. Are these things that we can handle internally, such as, can I build a team within my organization to fix my asset data, to go down and walk through all my assets and figure out what's sitting on the floor, what you're made, specifications, build out the parts list? Do we have the internal staff knowledge to do this? Same about items. Do we need to do that internally, or is that something we can maybe look at an external resource? Somebody that can perform those walkdowns for us, somebody that can look at an item and do this agnostically for us. There's different applications and tools that exist out there to do certain pieces of this, and we just have to, as a business, start looking early and say, how are we going to tackle this problem? Because yes, for the last 20 years, we've all collected a lot of data, but what does it really mean? And that kind of moves into the business objectives, the reporting and KPIs. Back to what Noel and biology here is, it's very important for us to first work with our stakeholders in the business and to understand, what do we need? What are we trying to solve? What do we want? What kind of story do we want the data to tell us? And how can we make better decisions based off that? And then we pile that on top of regulatory requirements. We go from a pharmaceutical company to a transportation company to a manufacturing, very different regulatory requirements that exist for each of those. Then it also, state by state. If we work with transportation companies, they might have to replace an air filter more often in California than they do in Ohio, just based on different regulations that state how we have to do it. So we have to understand what these regulatory requirements are that are going to drive our decisions and what kind of data we need. And then finally, is it readily available? We can look at, maybe, going back to the transportation industry. One of the first things that we can identify where there's problems in an asset is when your miles per gallon starts to drop off. So if your MPGs start to drop, but where am I getting that data? Well, there's onboard fleet telematics solutions that we can connect to. We can start pulling that in and adding that to our maintenance, to our maintenance management system. These are all places, where do we get this data, how we make the decisions, and ultimately what goals do we want from the business and for this to solve? And then finally, okay, great, we have good data, we can build some nice screens off of it, we can report on it, make some actionable decisions, but how do we maintain it going forward? That's a good part of it right here. And there's different levels here, and I kind of put 3 down here. You have people, roles and ownership of the data. Sometimes it can stop there. In a small organization, we've seen it very successfully, where a couple key individuals are put into key spots and they can control the data. That's great on small organizations, but as we start to move up in size of your organization, how many sites you have, how many people, how many new parts you're creating, we have to put more processes in place to standardize that data to make sure it's still actionable, good data. So, there are certain processes that you can build right into a Maximo type software. But as we start to grow and, get to the larger organizations, we start looking at applications. One of the applications we use is PartLink. That connects to our item data, and it allows us to look at thousands of items that are brought into Maximo and standardize them and do it within a 24 to 48 hour period. And all of a sudden, we're not slowing down the business, and we're providing global standards to organizations. So, at what point do you utilize one of these applications? At what size? And that's something, from a partner standpoint, from an Acrotas Solutions standpoint, where we come in and we help guide you down this path. So, once again, there's a lot of pieces that go into data management, but the one thing I want to drive home is a lot of this can be done early, and then it has to be put into a place, and the governance and the strategy has to be thought about early as well. So, thank you very much.
Great, James. Thank you, and thanks to our panel. And we're going to dive into some Q&A and some open discussion. So I'll again remind you all, if you do have questions for any of the panelists or the panel overall, please feel free to drop them into the chat, and we will do our best to address them. You may have seen I was keeping some notes here as you all talked about this, and I have a few questions for you all, and that this may help get us started with the discussion as other folks gather their thoughts and jump into the chat as well. So Balaji, I'm going to start with you. I'm kind of an old utilities guy myself, so I'm kind of interested in some of the things that you said. So data is exploding all around. I think we've established that operations are becoming digitized and just processes are changing. So in the utility world, I think what's arguably true is that the advent of the smart grid and the smart meter is driving a lot of this, the explosion of data that you all are dealing with and starting to develop use cases and drive value. There's a lot of opportunities, but also some challenges for sure. So how are you managing this massive growth in data from a governance and management perspective? And that's a loaded question. We could probably talk about that for a couple hours, but what are some things that occur to you as, especially because you're still fairly new in the role, and you come on board and you see these things happening and the data growing, and again, the speed and complexity therein, what are some things that you all are doing to really help manage this volume and the speed with which it's hitting you?
Oh, good, excellent question, Mike. I think, in any utility industry, as you can see, the grid is a big thing, right? So there's a lot of data. There's meter data or pole data, asset data. There's a lot of data. But the first thing what we've been doing is all this data is needed, right? Because over the period of years, there's a massive growth and amount of data. So do we need all the data? Do we can consolidate some data? Do we can do some cleanup of data, right? So as I said, one of the best example was the CU library. Like, we had so much of CU over the period of time. We saw so much of growth in the data because everybody was adding a CU library, right? Everybody in the brotherhood, because there's no control, there's no standards, there's no enforcement, there's no data steward, there's no data owner. So this was all growing. So one of the things that what we did was we identified those critical data elements, critical data areas, and putting some data owners first, make sure that we clean up the data. And then the second thing what we did was we also making sure that not everybody, like, how do we make sure that the segregation of duties, like, how do we make sure that 1 or 2 or 3 people are allowed to make the changes to the data? Because you do have an application where people can add the data. You have other sources of truth where people can add data, right? How do I minimize that number of people who can touch the data so that we can keep the data in a lower volume? And the number 3 is also, I think James was touching upon, right? This data is interrelated as we go through this massive transformation program. Customer data, your asset data, everything has to talk to each other so that we can provide that, the insights about the data anywhere, anytime, any device. So it's very, very important that you manage this data accurately and absolutely making sure that we have a good amount of data that can be accessible.
Let me ask you one quick follow-up question, because I heard you mention the critical role as you manage this big thing of the data owner. Can you just speak just for a minute about how is the data owner accountable to the quality and use of that data.
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of things, right? The data owner takes the responsibility because, as I said, comes from a business, because they know the data. So he or she takes the responsibility of ensuring the data is accurate, ensuring the data is in a good source, and also three, who has an access to update the data, right? We can't give an access to everybody in the company saying that you all can access the data. So the data owner not only make sure who has access to the data, but also to ensure that the data is accurate.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that accountability early and often is going to be super important. Noel, I want to ask you a question or two, if that's okay. We'll move on to you. One of the things I noticed that's interesting, and I don't know if it's probably not unique, but for today's session, it is peculiar to Skookum in that you have multiple sites. And what many of us have seen is when you have these multiple sites across different geographies, perhaps, each site has its own kind of data culture in terms of how it's managed. So I would imagine having things like standards in place is helpful. So can you maybe speak a little bit to how at Skookum data governance and data management enables you all to keep assets up and running? And if you could cite an example, maybe if there's a certain asset fleet where you had problems in the past that you've improved, or maybe a certain use case that you've been able to execute more effectively because the data management and the governance is sound.
I think, having good data governance and management really enables, initially our maintenance efforts. How are we doing maintenance? The right maintenance at the right time, the right parts, and the right craft or skill. So that, really supported really well. That also drives, asset reliability, keeping that asset operational and running, as intended is really important. And, it also really supports any client-facing asset management goals that they have. So, our data can help support any reporting or any requirements that our clients have at different sites. And again, it's really about, what drives that and makes that work is that multi-tiered leadership, across the organization. And I mentioned technician mobility is a really big enabler. And then, transforming that data, from the data to, actionable information, insights, and, to actually drive improvements, it is really, really beneficial. And, we've leveraged different types of data, bringing it into Maximo, making it accessible, especially for some critical lift pumps at certain bases. I think we had a Super Bowl Sunday critical pump failure just when we had just started up a big new contract. So we learned a lot about how critical those pumps are and the impact on the entire base if we can't get those, keep those operational. So, making some adjustments on monitoring those assets real time through online sensors has been really valuable. Also, auto alerts, again, leveraging technology to detect high level, low level, or loss of power. Getting those alerts right to our technicians. So taking that data, turning it into something actionable. And we've never had an unexpected failure since, kind of enabling those assets and digitizing their operations. So it's been good. Yeah.
Great. One thing I noticed from Balaji's remarks and yours, this the role of the different layers in the organization and each of them being accountable to their role. I think that's something that we really should underscore as a result of what we're hearing today. So that's super helpful. James, I do want to jump over to you and ask you one. We do have one that has come in that I want to ask you about in your opening, and I'll kind of add a little bit of my commentary to it. So in your opening remarks, you talked about how you go into an initiative with a client and everything seems to be all the boxes are checked, and you go in and you start the work, and as you said, sometimes the data isn't all that you hoped it would be, or it's not as billed. So how do you know when the data is not as good as hoped? Maybe it's when do you know the data is not as good as you had hoped? Is there a data cleansing or data quality process on the front end of, say, a Maximo implementation? And what do those red flags look like that maybe some of our listeners, folks who are with us today, can maybe look at and make sure they've got their data house in order from some of your experience?
Absolutely. So yeah, generally where this comes out is early in the project, because as we've established, data is always the longest pole in the tent for any of these implementations. So early on in the project, one of the first things that we do is a data workshop, and at that workshop we bring in those key individuals that own the data, house the data, understand the data, and we start putting in front of them the templates for a basic Maximo implementation. Let's start looking based on those goals and some of the discussions early on, and we understand what they want to do. We start saying, all right, do we have the data to support your initiatives here? And that happens early. It's typically a 3 to 5 day workshop where we're working and we're digging in. So our data experts with a Maximo perspective are starting to look at the data and start to ask questions. And when we start to understand what those KPIs are, what those reporting solutions that they're looking for, that's typically when we start to see the issues, and we start understanding maybe what's not there. So it's typically early on. But is it enough time to completely right the ship? It all depends. And I hate that answer, but it all depends on the quality of data in the individual organizations.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen it all. You've probably seen the full spectrum there for sure. So thanks, James. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We do have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask a couple more questions to our group. And again, if you all have additional questions, please feel free to jump in. Balaji, I want to go to something that you had discussed as you were kind of walking through. I think it was strategic, tactical, operational. At some point in that journey, the business side either gets involved, gets more involved, takes ownership. Can you just briefly describe what does that look like? So you've got your CIO and all these folks who are managing data, and that's kind of the world they live in. But at the end of the day, it's about solving some business issues, making things more efficient, executing on these critical use cases. So as you walk through that journey, what does it look like? Is it a handoff? Are they partnered through the whole process? That was one thing that I wanted to make sure that we just spent a minute on, just so folks in the audience can say, okay, this is how IT and the business side work together on these massive data sets resulting in business value.
Oh, excellent question. I think it's a partnership between IT and business, right? So because I know business comes back with data ownership, because they know the data, they own the data, they know what is an operational and financial impact of the data and all those good stuff. But IT, from a system standpoint, how the data is distributed across to the other system, right? The downstream systems, like we'll be sending some data to the customer system, we'll be sending some data to the supply chain system. So how the data is flowing and what is the impact on the data. So that's where IT comes into the picture. So it is a partnership on both the sides. And it's also not only just a partnership, Mike, it's also telling a story to our business owners, right? So why that's so important. For example, if I have a field dispatcher that I'm sending it to the field and I'm giving him wrong data where the pole is located, and he goes and he gets upset, this is not where the pole is, right? So it's very, very important. You're telling a story and working alongside with the business.
Yeah, I like that, telling a story that people can understand and have the data aligned to support the story. I think that's a key point. I do want to kind of open it up and ask you all collectively, if I could, a question or two. You all have, by the way, to our audience, this is, we have literally decades of experience here. I'm not calling everybody old. I'm calling everyone super experienced. And as we step back and look at all that, is there maybe a tip that you could share with our audience today, where if someone is on this journey of making sure their data is in the shape they want it to be in for different asset management applications. Is there one tip that really stands out? And this can be from your individual experiences in your organization, or in James's case, you may have seen some experiences at different clients. But I'm going to start with Noel on this. And what is maybe one thing that if someone is in an asset management, asset leadership position, they understand the value of getting the data right. But what's something that you can point them to and says, hey, think about this in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say look really hard at enabling your technicians with mobility, giving them, that direct access. I think that ultimately is going to solve, that gap in good quality asset data.
That's a really good one, because I think in just about every industry that's where it's heading. And I'm an old guy, and I can remember what the biggest problem used to be was getting the technicians in the field to stop using handwritten notes and map books with things scribbled in the margins, to today where the younger workforce, probably my kids' ages, they probably expect to have a tablet in the field, and they're used to working with it because they grew up with it. I think that's a big shift for us, and it really shortens the cycle on getting to where there's a lot of good things happening leveraging that data. So that was good. Thanks, Noel. How about you, James? What's something you see when you walk into an organization, you and your team, and you're maybe doing the data workshop, or maybe you're even further along? What's a good tip that you could share with our audience today, saying, hey, this is something you should really be thinking about and spending some time and effort on?
Well, I think Noel kicked it off there. It's your technicians in the field. These individuals, I mean, we talk about sensors every day, and how can we connect to a sensor to get a meter reading? But our biggest sensor, our most valuable sensor, are our technicians and our folks in the field. That's where the data is coming from. So, and you touched on it a little bit, Mike, as well. Going from the paper days to the tablet days, we still see many organizations that are still moving today from paper to electronics, and that's hard. That's a difficult transition for these individuals, and change is hard. And so we keep talking about the data and how to get it, but one of the biggest, most overlooked things is actually the change management around welcoming this aged workforce into the new technology age, where we're trying to gather this data and we're trying to input it into a system. But if it's not consistent, if it's not clean, if it's not sanitized, we aren't going to be able to do anything with it. So really, it comes back to change. If we can work with our individuals, have good change management, teach them how to use the tools that we're putting in the hand, that Noel's putting in their hands, those tablets, fill it out correctly, we're going to get great data that's actionable, that we can actually make decisions with at the executive level.
Very good. And I think I'm going to borrow or steal a line from you. Technicians are the most valuable sensors. I like that, because there is the push, of course, to automate. But boy, having seasoned, experienced folks with the right tools in the field, there's no replacement for that. Balaji, I'm going to bring it home with you. Is there maybe one thing that, in your vast experience, where if you were talking with someone like you are today, you can say, hey, here's where you want to make sure you're directing some time and effort to make sure you get your data right as you move forward with these different use cases? What would that look like?
I think I'm going to agree with James and Noah, because we are doing some of those things today as we speak, because our field techs knows very well, and we have to provide tools and resources so that they can collect the data, and they can also correct the data, right? Like, for example, if I'm sending a pole inspection guy and he watches all the poles, he says, oh, that data is not correct. So you should be able to mark the data right there and send the data to our system of record, which will update that data. So providing the tools and resources necessary for our field technicians would be really beneficial.
Very good. Very good. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Take care and have a great rest of your week.